This is the first lecture for Wednesday, April 8th. We looked at very briefly this idea that on land you've got a patchwork of different types of habitats. It has a big influence on the organisms that you find there. A lot of the patches are vegetation, but in terms of animals and other organisms, the distribution of vegetation, the type of patches that are there are, in other words, the properties of the landscape has big influence on organisms that are found on land. The same is true in the ocean. The ocean is a fairly patchy environment. There are some places where you have vegetation along the shoreline anyway. So it's a similar situation as landscape ecology on land with the patches of vegetation. However, the patches in most of the ocean refer more to some kind of a resource, especially food. So there's a number of different ecosystems in the ocean that are patchy in terms of the distribution of energy that will ultimately make its way up to large predators such as sharks. So that's what I want to talk about today, is this idea of the ocean as a landscape, patches in the ocean, and their influence on the movements of sharks out in the open ocean. So I want to introduce this idea that in the ocean, it's a patchy environment, and that patchy environment influences the way that animals, like sharks, especially highly mobile animals, move around. Now, if you look on land and you look at how animals move on land, here's a bee that is foraging. It's looking for pollen in a flower. These animals, it's very, very common for insects all the way up to moose or elephants to move in a patchy, from one patchy environment to another. Here's a bear that's gathering blueberries from a blueberry bush. And so what animals tend to do is they search an area, they search a bush, or they search some flowers, and then they move on to another patch. And they assess. It's not like they're sitting there thinking about this, but evolutionarily they've been selected to assess the quality of a habitat and the return on their investment. So in other words, if you're a bee or if you're a bear searching that blueberry bush, then there's still blueberries there, but they become less and less dense. It takes more of your time to find them. And so there's another blueberry bush just over there that you haven't picked blueberries from. So there's a lot more blueberries on that bush, but you've got to sacrifice some time to move over to that bush. Sometimes you can't even see that bush, but you're going to go on look for another one because based on your experience, you're going to run into one. So you're making this decision, not consciously, but from a natural selection point of view, as I said, from how long do you stay at this blueberry bush searching, and when do you leave that blueberry bush and move on to a new bush? Even if you can't see that bush, even if you don't know where that bush is, that there's a rate of diminishing returns for staying at this blueberry bush, going through the very last ones until there's finally no more blueberries. So animals are making those kind of decisions. Again, not necessarily on an individual basis, but on the basis of natural selection and their evolutionary history. Well, if you look in the ocean, here's the Western Pacific way out there by Asia, and this represents the amount of chlorophyll that there is in the ocean. Chlorophyll is related to primary production, which starts the flow of energy into these ecosystems. So basically, the more chlorophyll there is, the higher productivity there is in these parts of the ocean. And so you see here in this, as you watch this, the red are highly productive. There's a lot of photosynthesis taking place. That is eventually going to translate its way all the way up to relatively large organisms like whales or the sharks that I'm going to be talking about. But this illustrates this idea that the ocean is a patchy environment. And so what I want to talk about is how animals explore the ocean as a landscape, and explore the ocean particularly as not as a uniform landscape, but as a patchy landscape. And I want to use sharks to illustrate what kind of influence patchy environments have on the movement patterns of some highly mobile species. So I'm going to be talking about a number of different species of shark, just to give you an idea of this idea of searching an area, moving on to a new area, and then searching again. Here's a track of a mako shark that we tracked using a satellite transmitter. So there's this area up off of Canada that's rich in resources. Then the shark leaves. This is in February, March, makes a 7,000-mile trip down south, decides, oh, well, that's not a good location. So it started out searching this patch over by Maryland, off of the coast of Maryland, and stayed there for about a month. And then it made this long-distance move to this other patch off of Canada. And it's a relatively big area, but it's still searching. So this is what animals do in the open ocean. They search an area, and then they move on to the next area, and they search that area. So it's like the bee that's searching and spending a lot of time in one location collecting pollen from some dense aggregation of flowers, and then moving on to another one. Now, bees may not move 7,000 miles. They might move 7 miles in their lifetime. And we saw the same thing with a bear. A bear is searching one area and makes a directed movement to the next area, in the case of blueberries or whatever it happens to be eating. Well, with sharks, turtles, marine mammals, some other fish, the behavior of these animals in this patchy ocean has been revolutionized by the development of satellite transmitters as a technology for tracking their movements. And so this is where this information comes from that I'm going to talk to you about. There's a number of different types of satellite transmitters. There's this one that's highlighted here that you put on the dorsal fin of a shark, and the shark swims around carrying this transmitter there on its dorsal fin. When it comes to the surface, then this sends a signal. Here it is swimming along at the surface. Sends a signal to satellites that are orbiting, and the satellites triangulate a position, and then you get this long-term tracking information, long-term movement data from these sharks. You hear from these sharks in a lot of cases every single day for a year, 2 years, even 3 years. So it's revolutionized what's known about not just sharks, but turtles and whales and dolphins and birds, all kinds of animals that migrate long distances. You can't really keep up with them if you're a human trying to find out where they go. So this technology has really been successful in illustrating, quantifying where these animals go. So I want to show you again this idea that sharks move from an area where they search. They're searching, probably foraging. There's a rich food supply there. Here's another mako shark that up in September, it's off of Canada. And then in November, it makes this long distance movement all the way down to the Bahamas, and then back up off of South Carolina, North Carolina. Here it is. And then it's back to North Carolina. Relatively big area, but now it's searching there. And that's where it would spend the winter until it moved up the continental shelf, eventually back up off of Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York. So that's what mako sharks do. That's what these other species of sharks do that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about 3 species, but let me illustrate, first of all, the kind of data that you get. This is data from about 30 tiger sharks that we tracked in the western North Atlantic. Most of these were tagged in Bermuda. And so these sharks come to the surface, they get a location. This is where they were. So you see they're all over the place, basically. This whole western North Atlantic, there's a few gaps there, but for the most part, they're all over the place. A certain distance to the north, certain distance to the south. Those islands are kind of a barrier to their movement, and then they move certain distance out to the east. Not so much on the continental shelf. But what do you do with this data? How do you assess how these sharks like this that are generating these locations are utilizing this patchy environment? Well, that's what I want to talk about. And I want to illustrate these 3 different species. There's oceanic whitetip, mako shark, and the tiger shark. 3 different species that I've been investigating in terms of how they explore the ocean. They're really exploring the ocean. Or in other words, they're moving through this patchy landscape in the ocean. 3 different species. Sometimes you could find these in the same place, in the same day. They might be in the same location. But one of the points I want to illustrate is there are 3 different species with 3 different characteristics, 3 different life history characteristics, 3 different types of prey and predators. And so it shouldn't be that surprising that these 3 sharks, even though they're in the same habitat, that they utilize this habitat differently. They explore these landscapes. They respond to these patches in different ways, each one of these species. So we want to answer these 4 questions for each one of these species, as well as we can anyway. So we saw with the bear and with the bee and with these sharks that they exhibit this behavior where part of the time they're searching, foraging, feeding, collecting pollen, eating blueberries, and then part of the time they're transiting. We all do the same thing, maybe not so much right now, but typically we'd spend all this time where we live, and then we follow this route, oftentimes the same exact route, to school or to work, and we spend a lot of time there. So if somebody from outer space, some alien, abducted you and put a transmitter on you, pretty soon they would say, oh, we know what these humans do. It's very easy. They spend all this time in this one place, they transit to this other place, and they spend all that time there, and they transit back and forth between these areas where they're spending a lot of time. Same thing with animals. So that's the question, is where are these 3 different species of sharks searching, and what kind of patterns do they have in terms of transiting between those patches? Second question is, how big an area are they searching? Is it a small area? Is it a gigantic area? How big are these patches? And how are they responding to those patches? The third thing is, what kind of environmental cues are these sharks using to orient? You know, the thing that starts all of this is primary productivity, phytoplankton, these little tiny microscopic primary producers. Sharks don't eat those. Sharks can't sense those. They don't respond to those. However, there's environmental characteristics that are associated with water where there's a lot of primary productivity. There's a certain temperature. There's sometimes ocean fronts where 2 bodies of water mix that create a lot of upwelling and a lot of nutrients being mixed. And so sharks might not be able to tell where there's plankton, but they can certainly tell where there's food, and they can orient based on ocean conditions, the depth of the water, the distance from shore of the water, the sea surface temperature, those kind of things that are associated with in their past history of where they've come across food. So what kind of environmental cues are they using to be able to navigate, to be able to know where to search and to move between one patch and the other. And then not so much in terms of their ecology, but in terms of the consequences of where these sharks are going. They're going through the waters of a number of different countries. Who's responsible for managing these populations? This goes back, it's a combination of community ecology, this behavioral ecology, movement ecology, landscape ecology, and a section of ecology that we're done with is population ecology, because these different species of sharks and tuna and dolphins and whales, those populations are all being managed. So if you know whose waters they're in, are they in the U.S. waters? Are they in Canadian waters? Are they in waters of 25 different countries? Has big influence on how their populations are managed, especially how effectively their populations are managed. So we want to introduce a couple of ideas in terms of quantifying these type of behaviors that you see in sharks or whatever animal, bees or bear. If you're following their movement patterns, then you can look at, one, the distance between two locations. If you have a satellite transmitter, for instance, or if you have a radio collar on a bear, you can even put radio collars on insects. Not radio collars, but radio transmitters, the tiny little things they put on insects. You can track their movements. So for one, you can see the distance between two locations. Is it far? Is it close? Another thing is you can see what kind of pattern, what angle there is between multiple locations. Is it in a straight line, or is it at different angles? So in other words, you can imagine if you're walking around in circles, then one location to the next is not going to be very far apart. And the angle between these multiple locations are going to be less than 180 degrees. You're going to be turning and turning and turning. If you're walking straight down the sidewalk or a road or something, then one location is going to be farther apart than the other location. And consecutive locations are going to tend to be at 180 degrees from each other. In other words, you're going in a straight line. So you can quantify the behavior that an animal is exhibiting by looking at those things. And you can assess, you can make a designation of each location in terms of, okay, at this location, this animal was searching, or at this location, this animal was going straight or transiting. And so we've done this with mako sharks, for instance. That's the first animal that we'll talk about. But just sharks in general, or animals in general, you can look at these different movements, different locations that are generated by tracking, and you can designate each location as searching or transiting. So here's an example of a mako shark that was swimming around in New Zealand that we were tracking. And so for each location, the green ones show that's where this animal is transiting. The red ones is where they were searching. So if you looked at the distance between locations, if you looked at the angle between locations, and that's what is these behavioral modes are based on, searching or transiting. How big an area are sharks searching? Well, there's another method that you can use. You can use this method called first passage time. That's really pretty straightforward. In other words, you can look at this, you can run this model and analyze the data, but basically what you're doing is you're trying to see how big of a circle an animal is searching within. So if you look at a data from some a bee or a bird or a bear or a shark, and you see how far these locations are apart from one another. They're 10 feet apart, these locations, or they're 10 miles apart, or they're 100 miles apart. And if you plot these, then you get an idea basically of how long it takes them to move out of this circle of a certain size. If they're searching, it'll take a long time for them to get out of this circle. They're not going to get out of that circle very quickly because they're going around and around. If they're going straight, and of course they're going to leave this circle pretty quickly. So you can imagine if you had a turtle or something in a hoop, then if that turtle's just going around and around, it could take an hour for that turtle to leave that hoop. If that turtle's going very straight, that it could be out of that hoop in a minute. So that's how this type of assessing the size of the area that the searching is done. Here's an example with a tiger shark in Bermuda. Look at all these different locations, and you run that analysis, and you come up with this. The result is that this particular tiger shark was searching an area that's about 40 kilometers. This circle has a diameter of 40 kilometers. So you could do that for bees. You'd, of course, have a much smaller area. You could do that for raccoons. And see how big of an area they're searching. So those are the kind of methods that are used. In terms of assessing the environmental conditions, well, there's different ways that you can do this as well. Basically, though, if you look at how an animal is moving, here's a tiger shark that was tagged in Bermuda, and this is the sea surface temperature of this tiger shark. So it's got the date up there. This is September. And the water is pretty warm all the way up into the Atlantic. And then it starts to get cold. This is October. The shark swam down to the Bahamas, and it's swimming down there. So this shark is obviously, there's some behavior that's related to temperature. And now the temperature, this is January. It's pretty cold. You can see how cold the water is off the U.S. East Coast and up in Canada. You can see Cape Cod there and Long Island. Now it's April, and it's about this time of year. The water starts to warm up. The Gulf Stream, you can see it going up there, warming up the waters. Now it's May, and look at that blue dot there in the Bahamas. This shark is going to leave, but there it goes, and it takes off out into the open ocean in July. And there it is in August, way up north, 40 degrees north as opposed to the Bahamas. So you can look at environmental conditions like this. Sea surface temperature has a big influence on the movement of animals, productivity, that chlorophyll, and some other indices as well. Here's a mako shark to show you. There's this water that's a certain temperature, about 28 degrees or so. And this mako shark is moving around. That's Cape Cod, just south of there. It's going a little slower, but this is in October. That big plume of warm water is starting to move south. And so now it's way down there off of the mid-Atlantic. And this mako shark is swimming along, spending a fair amount of time along this boundary where between the warm and the cold water. So this mako shark has moved south. Now it's off of New Jersey, and it's moved all the way down by the Carolinas in the winter. So same thing with the tiger shark, that the movement of these animals, you'd see the same thing for a lot of animals that migrate. There's a big influence for temperature on their movement. So if you look at a number of different environmental conditions and their influence on these sharks, not so much in where they go, but in terms of their behavior, are they searching or are they transiting? Are they going straight or are they going around in circles? Well, if you look at sea surface temperature, they search and they transit about the same in different temperatures. So there's not much of an effect temperature. Temperature certainly influences where they are, but not so much what they're doing when they're in these different locations. So they might be up north when it's warm, but the amount of searching that they do isn't so correlated to sea surface temperature. Frontal index, that's an indication of how much currents and water interface between two bodies of water. What this does is creates upwelling, brings nutrients up, and it tends to be associated with primary productivity. And in fact, if you look at primary productivity and chlorophyll, which is in the phytoplankton that's doing this primary productivity, now you see that there's a difference. There's a significant difference in areas where they're searching versus where they're transiting. Where are these sharks searching? It doesn't have to do with temperature, but it has to do with where these waters are mixing. It has to do with how much primary productivity there is. It has to do with how much phytoplankton there is in chlorophyll. They're spending significantly more time searching in areas that have a lot of energy. So you can quantify the movement patterns of sharks or whales or fish in relation to environmental conditions such as these. And then this last question, before we get into the individual species, is what countries are being used? So if you look at a tiger shark, for instance, each country has its own waters. This tiger shark moved from Bermuda to international waters, and now it's down into the waters of the Bahamas. So this is in the waters of two countries. Now it's back up, now it's spent a little bit of time in U.S. waters. And so you can look at all these different exclusive economic zones, EEZs, of each country, and how much time each shark spends in the waters of each country, and as a whole, how much time different species spend in the waters of each country. You get an idea of who's responsible for the management of these populations. All right, well, that is a good place to stop for this first half of the lecture, because in the next part, we're going to talk about these three different species of sharks: oceanic white-tip sharks, mako sharks, and tiger sharks, and see how each one of these different species moves around in the ocean.